Dr. Janja Lalich, thank you very much indeed for coming on to talk police from your home in Walnut Creek, California. Now, I was fortunate enough to have met you last year when I filmed one of your London talks. And I know you do a heck of a lot of interviews and traveling, so I'm very grateful to have you on this show. So I'm just wondering if you've survived all those horrible fires out there in California. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Of course, last year I was in Chico, and when the Paradise Fire happened about a year ago now, and that was horrendous. The whole town of Paradise burned down. So,
gosh,
and then just this week there's another huge fire around Santa Barbara, and it's just endless.
Yeah, it's pretty awful. But you seem to be okay. It was just the main thing.
So far I've done all right. I mean, there's people who've lost everything, lost their lives, so I can't complain.
Well, you are, of course, a researcher, an author, an educator, and professor emerita of sociology at California State University, Chico. You've studied and taught about the subject of cults for more than 25 years. You've written several books, including Take Back Your Life, Escaping Utopia, and, of course, Bounded Choice, all of which have been mentioned or quoted by many of my guests over the years, and they really seem to help them. So that's great. But today we're going to be talking about the cult known as NXIVM and the trial of its leader, Keith Raniere, or is it Raniere? Perhaps you can tell me how to pronounce that.
I've heard it Raniere, so I guess that's how he says it.
We'll say Raniere, I guess.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about your involvement in that. But before we dive into that, let's just spend a little bit of time on your early life. You yourself were in a cult back in the 70s and 80s, a left-wing political cult called the Democratic Workers' Party.
Right.
So can you give us a brief overview of the group and its aims and how you eventually escaped?
Well, this was in the mid-70s, and there were a lot of small, what the French called groupuscules, like small groups, small Marxist-Leninist organizations. A lot of people on the left at that time were trying to figure out what to do. The Vietnam War had just ended, so it was like, what was the next challenge? And I got recruited because I had just moved back to America after living on Formentera in the Balearics, a Spanish island, for about 4.5 years. So I was newly back in America, trying to integrate into society there. And, a friend of a friend introduced me to join a study group, and from there I joined the background group that was behind it, and supposedly we were going to fight racism and sexism and classism and make social change, all that wonderful stuff. And of course everything was really just about the leader, who was a megalomaniac, very troubled woman, actually a former sociology professor herself. So I was in for about 10.5 years. It was a very restricted group. We pledged to dedicate our lives. We were on call 24 hours a day. We worked 18, 20 hours a day, 7 days a week, year after year. So especially those of us who joined early on at the sort of 10-year mark, we were exhausted. And a lot of stuff, it's too much to go into. People could read Bounded Choice to get more of the story, but at some point, just things started to bust open. The leader left town to go to Bulgaria, which at the time was her dream place, and this was still during the days of the Iron Curtain. And so while she was out of the country, everybody met. We all met, and it took days. Several of us stood up and said, this is a cult, the leader's a drunk, et cetera, et cetera. It took about 3 days to convince the other members. And eventually, the night before she came back, we took a vote, and we voted unanimously to expel her and unanimously to dissolve the organization. So ultimately, everybody got out. So we all helped each other get on our feet, write recommendation letters for jobs and references and clothes. Right. And, we had nothing. I had spent 10 years really socially deprived, if not deprived in many other ways. But yeah, so I went to New York to get a job because I wanted to be away from the Bay Area. And, here I was in this cultural mecca. And, I'd seen maybe 2 or 3 movies in the 10 years and didn't know anything about culture or anything. And so it was it felt like I was let out of prison. And yet it was also very anxiety producing and very stressful, just trying to become a regular person again.
Yeah, I bet. Wow. Janja, you've testified in several cases as an expert witness over the years, but most recently you were able to observe several weeks of the recent trial of Keith Raniere, the leader of the cult with the almost unpronounceable name of NXIVM. This was in the news a lot because of the celebrities who had been part of it and who had been involved in the sex trafficking and forced labor, amongst other things. But first, let's talk about the cult itself. Janja, what exactly is or was NXIVM?
Well, NXIVM essentially offered self-improvement courses for professionals, primarily in the entertainment industry. So NXIVM was kind of a front for the cult. NXIVM itself had several front groups that offered these courses, like ESP, Executive Success Program, et cetera, et cetera. And so thousands of people took these courses, which are unfortunately very popular here in America, at least, these leadership training courses, management training courses, self-improvement courses, and people pay thousands to go listen to some, self-proclaimed person who knows everything. So part of these front groups were used to obviously bring money into the organization and to lend legitimacy. And then Keith Raniere, who was behind all of this, who was headquartered in Albany, New York, would have people recruit, obviously, as most cults do, from their friendship networks or from their professional networks, and eventually set up an extremely disciplined cult structure among these true believers, some of whom ran centers around the country, for example, in Los Angeles and in Vancouver, Canada, in the state of Washington. And Keith Raniere himself he's probably one of the worst cult leaders I've ever heard of. Wow. In my years of studying this. He was an absolute sadistic, pedophile, sexual abuser, misogynist. And, but he, as cult leaders do, he had these people who were enthralled with him and recruited their friends. And eventually they set up a sort of secret inner circle called DOS, D-O-S, which was Latin for dominus something or other, which basically meant master over slave. And he set up a master-slave structure among the women. And some of these women were brought to a place and branded in their pelvic area, like literally branded like you brand a cow with a hot iron. And eventually, people found out and people went to the press. Sarah Edmondson in Vancouver was one of the first people to help blow the whistle, along with Mark Vicente in LA and some other folks. And so the whole thing kind of blew up. Although I have to say there are still NXIVM followers and believers, even though he was convicted on 7 federal accounts of sex trafficking, labor trafficking, wire fraud, identity theft, child pornography, etc. He still has believers who still meet. Some of them are in Mexico. Yes, there's a group in Mexico and on the East Coast, and probably scattered around the country. So yeah, there are still believers, and he's in prison awaiting sentencing.
One of the most famous things about this trial is that celebrities got involved in, for instance, Allison, Mack, and other Smallville stars. Right. Is that still part of it now? Do you know, or
of the believers?
Yeah.
Well, I don't believe Allison Mack is, but certainly, as far as I understand, Claire Bronfman and her sister Sarah Bronfman, who were the heirs to the Seagram fortune, Seagram whiskey, and poured literally millions and millions into Keith Raniere's pockets. Claire is awaiting sentencing, and but she is, as far as I know, an absolute still true believer. And her sister Sarah is still running some of the cult's schools for children in France. So yeah, and that's always a concern for people who speak out, because of the money and their ability to litigate against people, which is what they did for years against the naysayers and the people who left. Absolute legal harassment.
Right. Okay. So time to get into the trial itself. In March 2018, Keith Raniere was arrested and indicted on a variety of charges. His federal trial began on May 7, 2019. You were invited to attend the trial by a documentary crew who you had filmed with earlier in the year. The 8-part documentary entitled The Vow will air on HBO early next year. So why did they want you to be with them at the trial in Brooklyn?
Well, they had filmed me earlier in the year, or I guess, or the year before, I can't even remember. But they had filmed me meeting some of the former members, such as Mark Vicente and Donnie Peace, his wife, and several other people who were in New York at the same time that I was. And they wanted to meet me because, happily, Mark Vicente, I believe, was the first one who came across my book, Take Back Your Life. And he wrote a long letter to other followers and suggested that they get my book. And so many of the former NXIVM people have read my book and have found it very helpful, which was, you know, really exciting for me to hear. So they wanted to meet me, and they were there filming because at the time, Raniere was having hearings at the courthouse in Brooklyn. And we were, I was in New York filming a different documentary series, also in Brooklyn. At any rate, or in Lower Manhattan, in Lower Manhattan. So the makers of this documentary are Jahan Nujim and Karim Amir, who just filmed this incredible documentary called The Great Hack. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's
it sounds familiar. Yes,
it's about Cambridge Analytica and Facebook and how the 2016 election was totally.
Oh yes, it was on over here. Yes.
Yeah. So The Great Hack, which is on Netflix, is an amazing documentary. Well, this couple who are Egyptian American filmed that, and Jahan has won just about every documentary award you can win. She herself had dabbled in NXIVM at some point, which is what interested her in then doing the documentary. Her friends, people she knew stayed in, were there until the very end. And so that's what kind of inspired her to tell the story, which I think will be fantastic. So when the trial started, they contacted me and wanted me to basically reconnect with the people I had met earlier, and also they wanted to get my impressions of the trial. And so that's why they brought me out to New York, and I was there for, I believe it was 2 weeks of the trial until the end.
Right, let's just go into the trial and the days that you attended. So what were the highlights of this trial, and what were some of your reactions?
Wow. I mean, the highlights were many, and the difficult times were many during those 2 weeks. Not, of course, not just for me, but for everyone, especially for the people who had been part of the organization. Anyway, I got there the first day of trial. You know, it was a rather small courtroom, and so they only had 2 rows in the back for the public. And so people lined up as early as 6 o'clock in the morning to be able to get in. Wow. Because I think 8 and 8, I think maybe 16 people from the public could be in that last row. 1 row then was for any of friends of the defense. Another side were friends of the plaintiffs or the attorneys, the prosecuting attorneys. There was a row for the media. So anyway, we always got there early, and the first day I was sitting in one of these back rows, and the lawyers were arriving and setting up their desks, and then, this door opens and Raniere is brought in. And I was just stunned. I mean, here's a guy who slept with literally hundreds of women, had thousands under his control, and certainly hundreds under his immediate control, who would do anything for him, including the most vicious, obscene things. And the guy comes out the door, and he's this short, not quite pudgy, but a little bit stocky, and has sort of nothing hair, and sits down, and he has like what I call a fish mouth. He has this mouth that goes all the way down like that. And he's the most unlikable looking character, and just like this little twerp. And I just thought, Napoleon complex. This is really one of the things that motivated him to control and abuse so many people.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was my first impression. But what was most, there's so many things. What was most moving, I would say, was certainly the testimony of the women who had been part of the organization, who were so brave to get up there and talk about their experiences, talk about how they were abused, talk about the manipulations and the psychological machinations to get them to do things. And all during the trial, it was interesting because Raniere never looked at the jury. He was sitting straight across from the jury. He never looked at the jury. And whenever one of these women who had been a follower was testifying, he would just sit like this with his chin on his hands and just glare at them. And it was just disgusting.
Was he trying to intimidate them, or?
That's my impression. Yes. I mean, I think that was all of our impression. And of course, the jury, interesting about the jury was 9 men and 3 women. And I think he never looked at him because he knew he wasn't going to be able to sway them in any way. They weren't his mark. They weren't his audience. Most of the rest of the time, Keith sat there writing on little post-it notes and passing things to his lawyers and looking at and typing on a laptop computer, acting like he's barely paying attention to this trial that's likely to put him in prison for the rest of his life. I mean, the arrogance and it was just appalling.
Is it some sort of show, or do you think that it was just his natural inclination to do that?
Well, I think probably part of it was for show, to act like, oh, this isn't bothering me. He doesn't really care what's going on in the world around him. I mean, the other fascinating thing about the trial were the prosecutors. The 2 prosecuting attorneys from the U.S. court, federal prosecutors, were young women. I mean, they look young to me. I mean, hey, I'm almost 75. So, I suppose, I mean, they looked like they were in their 30s. Maybe they were a wee bit older. Both of them were small. Small in stature, and they always wore, very chic suits and spike heels. And the way they ran that trial was absolutely magnificent, and they were so tough. And so it was such a delight to see these 2 young, really bright, tough women bring down this absolute sleazebag, sex offender. And I'm sure it really bugged the crap out of him, that it was women who were doing this. So anyway, the trial had many, many shocking moments. I think for me, I mean, I had known about the group for a long time. I didn't know about the horrors of the group until the story broke in the New York Times with, Sarah Edmondson showing her scar on her pelvic area. But so much more came out in the trial that was just horrific. That was just, you were gasping. I was gasping, and I've been doing this for, I know you said 25, it's really now 35 years. And it was just absolutely astounding, the things that he did. I mean, they were planning to build a dungeon in one of the houses. I mean, the ways in which he tortured women. and sexually abused them. One of the women, they were told by their masters, to go kind of seduce him and do whatever he said. And so one young woman he would walk with them at night in the neighborhoods in Albany around their homes. They had a bunch of homes in the same neighborhood. And one of the women he took to a place, blindfolded her, tied her down on a board, some kind of, platform. And as she was blindfolded, another woman performed oral sex on her while he walked around the table talking to her. And yeah, I mean, just really sick stuff. And so, to hear these women talk about that, in a calm voice. I mean, of course there were tears, and there were tears in many of our eyes of us in the audience, to really hear what these people went through and what kind of a horrible, torturous system he created. And also, I have to add, he also manipulated the men. He had special groups for the women. It was called jeunesse, which was supposed to, teach women how to be better women. And then he had also a group like that for the men called SOP, which I can't remember what that stands for.
I didn't even know there were men at all involved. I got the impression it was all women.
Oh yeah, no. There were many men, and basically they were trained to be absolute misogynists like him. There's one former member that I've worked with, who once her husband started attending these sessions, from the very first session he came home and he was like a different person to her and treating her abusively and calling her names. And I mean, just like that, it would happen overnight of how he would also manipulate the men. And in the women's sessions, I mean, this is one of the things that came out in the jeunesse women's session. He did a whole teaching on how it's okay to have sex with children, and that the children may actually enjoy it. It's like tickling them, and who are we to say it's wrong? And so the real abusers are those of us who, when that person grows up, tell them they were abused. Until then, they didn't know, they didn't think about it. And they showed this on tape, of him speaking about this on tape. So it's not like his lawyers could then say, oh, he never said that. I mean, we got to see the video where he said this, and also that rape, that women enjoy rape, that women don't really have a real orgasm until they are raped, because when you are raped, you can really let go. I mean, that's the kind of appalling, disgusting stuff that he taught his people, and it boggled the mind. I mean, as much as I know about psychological influence and brainwashing or bounded choice, whatever we want to call it, it's still, this was one of the most shocking things to me, that these women were so indoctrinated, that they could buy into this. And anyone who questioned, of course, was berated and brought on the carpet and humiliated, and the usual kind of damage control.
I suppose it is shocking, and it seems to be twofold with these cults. One is that there can be a leader like this, and two, that there can be others influenced by this.
Yes, and all of his second in commands were women who had been with him for years. Allison Mack being the last, and other women before that, and then all these other stories came out about the women who were his lovers, even though, he was sleeping with all kinds of women, because women are supposed to be monogamous, but men are polygamous, and that's the way it is. But the women who were with him for a long time, several of them developed cancer and died while they were in the group. And there's all kinds of questions about that, because he was the one administering their chemo. And one woman who died, they continued to use her credit card for years afterwards and charge things on her credit card. There's other women who've died mysteriously, bodies that have never been found. I mean, there's all kinds of drama and scandals and suspicions all around this group. And of course, people worked for practically free. I mean, some of the coaches got money, but then they poured it right back into the organization. And then there was the Mexican connection. You know, he recruited some elite individuals from Mexico, including one of the former president's sons and another wealthy Mexican family. And then they brought three sisters up to New York from Mexico on fake IDs. That's where the identity theft came from. They created a passport from a person who was dead, a Canadian who was dead. Anyway, he brought these Mexican sisters who were young, and their parents were followers, so they didn't complain. He brought them to Albany. He had sex with all three of them. One of them was attracted to another man, and Raniere got jealous, and so they locked her in a room for 2 years.
2 years?
2 years. They locked her in a room with just a mattress on the floor and a pad of paper and a pencil so that she could write apologies to Raniere every day, which he, of course, never accepted. She testified at the trial. The oldest sister in that group has a child with him, and the last I heard is still a believer. So, you know, I think probably some of the Mexican organizations in the prisons might not feel too kindly toward Raniere, which is one of the things I'm hoping for. He's already had a pretty rough time in prison. And he also took pornographic photos of young girls, including the youngest of the Mexican girls. And he kept all these photographs on his hard drive. And this was one of the toughest moments at the trial. They had a binder of these pornographic photos of this girl who I believe was 15 at the time. And they had a binder with these photos in it, and they were going, one of the assistants to the prosecutor was going to show it to the to the jury. We in the audience didn't see them. And they just would turn very slowly, turn a page. And the people in the jury were just, I mean, you could sense the heart palpitations. You could sense the anxiety. The men, especially the men who seemed as the Muslim men, would absolutely just turn their eyes down like this, cover their eyes. The women were, you know, gasping like that. And so the whole place, I mean, you could have heard a pin drop, and the tension in the room was absolutely palpable. It was the heaviest moment of the 2 weeks that I spent in there. It was astounding. You know, so it was day after day, you know, 2 weeks of that kind of thing. And the poor jury, I mean, they had 6 weeks of that. I was saying, you know, they're going to need to have counseling when this trial is over, because the stuff that they had to hear and see. But, you know, Raniere, despite the fact that he proclaimed himself the smartest man in the world with an IQ higher than Einstein, he was not so smart. I mean, he had emails and these photographs and so much stuff that they were able to find that was shown during the trial, that there was no way to dispute what it was about. And one of the best things, this is one of the happy moments in the trial. You know, he always said he was the smartest man in the world, and that he had 3 degrees from RPI, this you know, very fancy polytechnic institute, and that he had a degree in physics and chemistry and I don't know what, you know, 3 sciences. So they showed his transcripts from college, and it was hilarious because he had mostly C's and D's. He had F's. He was on probation twice. And his final average at graduation was something like 2.3 or 2.4, which for those who aren't Americans, that's like a D plus, you know.
Like delusions of grandeur, really, isn't it?
Oh, really? I mean, he you know, absolute total loser. And yet, you know, he had whatever it took to wrap people around his finger and damage so many lives. I mean, I'm still working with a number of people who were part of that, who were, close to the top. And, the trial was very good for them. It was such a release because, it was a vindication of what they'd been through. And it was great to see him convicted. But, they're still unraveling what was done to them. I mean, it's terribly, terribly traumatic. And
I understand that during those weeks you stayed with some former NXIVM members. So what was that like?
Yes, I mean, that for me was wonderful. I have to pull my sleeves down because it's very cold here. We were in Brooklyn, and the documentary crew arranged for a very big Airbnb. And so I was there with, 5 or 6 or 7 people who had been in the group, mostly women, but then also Mark Vicente, who was he's a filmmaker, and he was almost like second in command to Keith early on, especially, and filmed everything. Keith wanted him to film everything, which is another reason feds have so much of this stuff. But anyway, so we would, go to the trial together, go to lunch together. The film crew was often filming us. And then in the evenings, we would order food in and we would talk. And, sometimes I would be sitting individually with someone or with 2 people, or we would all be sitting around the table. There were, a couple of people who were literally stand-up comedians who had us rolling on the floors. And also there were some hard moments of crying and people feeling guilty and regretful, and all the things you go through because clearly this was so raw. It was all coming out every day. But it was really an extraordinary time for me to be with all of them, and hopefully I was able to also just kind of a shoulder to lean on and just talk about their stories and what happened to them. And so it was really it was so much better than just staying in a hotel by yourself, and going back and forth every day. I mean, we really became like family. And also with the filmmakers, I have to say, Jahan and Kareem and all the guys they had and women who were their producers, their assistants, their film people, their the cameramen, their soundmen. Everybody was so phenomenal, and we just had such a great time together. I mean, I really feel like all those people are my family at this point, and I'm really hoping and looking forward to going back for the sentencing. Raniere's sentencing will be happening on January 17th, and I'm hoping we'll all gather again in Brooklyn and have a great celebration, because I can't believe, being convicted on 7 federal counts, that he won't get life in prison.
Right, Janja, there must be people watching this and saying to themselves, I would never be so stupid as to get involved in a cult. I know you've heard this before, but people don't just join cults, do they? They don't join the per se. NXIVM was touted as a multi-level marketing company, as you said, a self-improvement group. So that's how they did it, isn't it right?
Yes. I mean, no one knowingly joins a cult. I mean, people get invited to something. I mean, it's always important to remember that more than 2/3 of people who are in cults got recruited by a friend, a family, or a coworker. And I can't say that enough. And I say it in every interview because I think it will help people understand how someone gets involved. I mean, somebody invites you to something. It's somebody somebody you respect. It's somebody who, even if it's not your best friend, it's much harder to say no to someone you know. And so once you go to that first thing, then the cult recruiters are very good at taking you along to the next steps and getting you to.
I know you said in was one of your books that they're not these stupid people. They're quite above average intelligence, aren't they?
Absolutely. I mean, cults want people who can perform for them. They want high functioning individuals. Cults want people who can run their businesses, bring in money, bring in important contacts, lend legitimacy to the group, work long hours, be creative, be inventive, while at the same time being disciplined and loyal. But cults don't want sad sacks or lazy people or people who have issues, either physical or mental. I mean, many groups, even the group I was in, we had someone at one point who, what was slightly disturbed and had problems focusing and things like that. We got rid of her as fast as we could. And, of course, there's stories of the Unification Church of the Moonies doing the same thing and, dropping people off in front of, mental health institutes. I mean, they don't want to take care of you. There's no pension plan. Believe me, you're there to take care of the cult and take care of the leader. And so they look for A-type personalities. They look for the best and the brightest and the money. They look for people with money. And people with money are often susceptible because they sometimes have a lot of guilt about having all that money. And they think, in the case of NXIVM, they said their whole thing was about ethics and it was a humanitarian organization. And so, Claire Bronfman just turned over her millions, because she thought this was going to change the world to a better way. So people shouldn't think it's stupid, weird, crazy people. It is not at all. And I think, unfortunately, sometimes the media has skewed that by just highlighting some of the really worst tragedies and not really going into in-depth explanations. I think that's changing somewhat these days, which is good. I think there's been better in-depth stories about cults in the media, and I think these podcasts have helped and things like that. So hopefully the general public's getting a better education about it and a better understanding. I just wanted to say, even though that perhaps there's a better understanding, what we still don't have as a society are the resources to help people coming out of cults.
Yes.
And that's one thing I'd really like to see, because people need. They need broke. They're suffering from PTSD. They grew up in the cult. They have all kinds of different issues from those of us who joined as adults, and there's no place for people to go, at least not in America. And so it's very, very difficult, and people end up, in the streets or getting caught up in something else bad again. And we really need to have social resources. It's a public health issue for sure.
Okay, wow. Janja, that was really incredible. So fascinating. Thank you so much for this insight into the NXIVM trial and into cults in general. If people want to learn more from you, I will leave links to your books in the description below, plus a link to your website, which of course is cultresearch.org. Right. And before we say goodbye, what's on the agenda for you? I'm assuming more TV, podcasts, talks, etc.
Yes. I did an interview earlier this week on the Mind Shift podcast. I have, I think, a film crew coming here in December for another documentary about Heaven's Gate, the cult that committed suicide. And I'm toying with the idea of starting my memoirs. So it's the first time I'm saying this publicly. So maybe that'll keep me at it.
Exclusive.
Exclusive, exactly. And
you'll have to have a chapter on the NXIVM trial, I think, after what you told me.
Mark, I really want to thank you for pursuing me in the way that you did. I know we've been trying to do this, I think, since August. And one thing after another happened in my life, and I just want to thank you for being persistent, because I love your.
Thank you.
I love your podcast. They're podcasts, right? I mean, I'm so bad with technology.
Well, YouTube channel and occasional podcasts.
Whatever they are, I love them. I think you're doing great work, and I'm so glad to be part of the program.
Janja Lalich, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mark.